Well, thanks, Eric, for the introduction and for the invitation to speak here today. It's a real pleasure. I studied in Sweden a couple summers ago, and it's great to be back. So today I'd like to talk about South Korea's role and interests in the Arctic. I think we often hear about China and Japan, but less so do we hear about South Korea. So today I'll do my best to give a brief overview of what I see them doing in the circumpolar north. And I've been studying this for, since last fall, so I'm not really an expert, but I'll do my best to explain a little bit today. So in order to sort of see what South Korea is doing today, I'd like to step back about 100 years and see where the country's really come from. This is a picture of Seoul in 1913, and you can see that compared to today, the country is really not developed, not industrialized. It's pretty agrarian still, very traditional society that really only opened up to the rest of the world in, I think, 1873. So just sort of coming to grips with trade and different things like that, and beginning to industrialize not until the second half of the 20th century. So during the 20th century, Korea had a tough time by any standards, I think. There was Japanese colonization and then American occupation and the war. So if we look at this picture, this is taken in 1973 when President Park Chung-hee, the second president of Korea, launched a program of heavy chemical industrialization. So this was really seen as a means for Korea to become self-sufficient by developing 6 key industries, and those were, if I can remember all of them, automobiles, shipbuilding, electronics, petrochemicals, steel, and one other one. But essentially you'll see that these are a lot of the industries that are really driving Korea's interests in the Arctic today. So industrialization was basically seen as a national obligation, so they really harnessed a number of different aspects of Korean culture, especially Confucianism, to pretty much really motivate people to see that the country needed to industrialize to become pretty much independent and sufficient. So what that's brought Korea to today, this stage in its development, is now it's, I would argue, one of the most technologically advanced societies in the world. This is a picture of Seoul 100 years after the first one I showed you, and you can see that there's a lot of gleaming skyscrapers, but not only that, the country has really strong science and technology education. I think its students test pretty highly in those fields. They have some of the world's fastest broadband speeds. You can stream video on your smartphone in the subway for the past several years. So those are just a couple of illustrations of the way it's really advanced technologically. So with that in mind, the question I pose is, why is Korea interested in the Arctic? I think it does share a lot of similarities with China and Japan, which I'll kind of talk about, but there's also some ways that Korea is set apart from the other Asian states in seeking to define its role in the Arctic. And so one of those industries that I mentioned before that Korea began developing in the 70s is shipping. So whereas in the 60s, Korea really had no shipbuilding industry to speak of, today it's actually the world's largest shipbuilding nation. It has the country's, 3 top shipbuilders, or the world's 3 top shipbuilders. 2 of those are Samsung Heavy Industries, which I think the outgoing president was the former CEO of, and there's also Hyundai Shipbuilding. So those are some of the key companies in the world today. And just to go back, we can also see that shipping and shipbuilding is also very important to the Korean economy. The export of ships themselves constitutes 10% of the country's exports. So this is one reason why it's really interested in Northern Sea Route, is not just for the possibility of shipping goods, but even to just sell the ships that are going to be plying that route. I think Korea has really advanced in terms of building ships that have the technology to sail in icy waters, so this is a key area where the economy can grow for Korea. And also, if we look at the last statistic here, shipping is responsible for 99.8% of Korean trade. So almost all the imports and exports carried into this country are done overseas. And if we kind of think about Korea, essentially it is an island because the only connection it has to the Eurasian landmass is through North Korea. And there are there's no roads, no railroads going from Russia through North Korea to South Korea. It's pretty much everything has to go by ship. So shipping is vital for the Korean economy during peace, and also just to have strong ships in general. This is I think, seen as part of the sort of national security aspect of the country if war were to break out. They need to have strong naval capabilities as well. So we can see this is sort of the way in which Korean shipping and shipbuilding stands today. And in fact, last year, I think Korea received 57 orders for LNG tankers. And these are some of the world's most advanced ships, and they're also the ships that would possibly be shipping gas along the Northern Sea route from places like Hammerfest in northern Norway, or possibly Stokman, if that's ever developed in Russia. We might be able to see some transits of LNG using Korean-built ships. And just last year, 2 ships did in fact carry LNG from the north along the Northern Sea route to Korea. So there's starting to be small developments in that area. And just to show a few more numbers, the start of the heavy chemical industrialization in the 70s really was also sort of went hand in hand with trade-oriented industrialization. So that means that all these things that Korea is building, be it ships, be it automobiles, these are things that have to be essentially exported out in order for the country's economy to keep growing, because Korea, especially compared to China and Japan, has a pretty small domestic market. They have 50 million people, which I guess is more than, say, here in Sweden, but compared to China or Japan's population, it's pretty small, so they're looking to the rest of the world to sell their goods. And just to show the numbers here, the ratio of trade to GDP is a lot higher for Korea than China and Japan. It's been called a superdependence by Alice Amsden, a scholar in Korea who came up with this term to really demonstrate how much it relies on trade for its economy. So I think this is one of the reasons why Korea, of all the Asian states, might be more interested in just the pure shipping aspect of the Northern Sea route, because it needs to diversify its shipping routes and trade routes in order to ensure economic growth. If anything were to happen along the Suez Canal, say, this is really another option Korea could have, the Northern Sea route, in order to get goods to and from Europe. Okay, so next I want to look at hydrocarbons. This is sort of one area in the Arctic that I think is maybe less certain or unclear what's going to happen than shipping. Certainly, Korea is one of the world's largest importers of hydrocarbons. It's the world's 2nd largest importer of LNG after Japan, and the 5th largest importer of crude oil. So essentially, the country really doesn't have too many resources of its own, so it's looking to the rest of the world to get its energy and fuel all those economies that are really all those industries that are really energy intensive, such as shipbuilding or making steel. People used to be really excited, I would say, in 2008 about the prospect of energy in the Arctic, but if we think about it today, especially with the fracking revolution in the US and oil sands in Canada, I think it's less clear if these resources are going to be developed in the Arctic in the near future, but diversifying to include some sort of northern sources in its portfolio is still something I think Korea is interested in doing. And this is because right now 80% of its oil, for instance, comes through the Suez Canal, and with all the geopolitical tensions there, I think Korea wants to sort of keep its options open. So certainly it's looking at other places like Australia for LNG. It also already gets a lot of natural gas from Malaysia and Indonesia. But lately it's been sort of, putting out feelers for northern parts of the world. I think in 2011 it sent the Korean Gas Corporation sent a delegation to Bathurst in the Northwest Territories in Canada to consider building an LNG export terminal there. And I really haven't heard too much more about that lately, about whether that's going to come to fruition, but I do know that Korea, along with China and Japan, the countries are investing in an export terminal in British Columbia. So they're starting to look across the Pacific for these energy resources rather than just to the Middle East. So I think this is one area where Korea is sort of keeping the Arctic as an option in the, say, next couple of decades if a lot of the oil and gas resources end up being developed. And the third chief interest that I identify that Korea has in the Arctic has to do with science. So I mentioned that the country really places a premium on education in, say, science, engineering, technology, and math. And I think this is one reason why Korea sort of also seeks to have some sort of prestige in Arctic research. This here is a picture of the Arayon, which is Korea's icebreaker. It was built in 2009, and it's gone on several expeditions so far, and also it's done a joint expedition with Canada. So we really see Korea trying to do a lot of bilateral collaboration with other countries, not just economically, but also scientifically. And like China, they have a like China and Japan, they have a research station on Svalbard, and they have a polar institute as well, which has been around for about 25 years. So I think one of the reasons why Korea is also interested in doing this research is because, like pretty much every country on Earth, it's going to be affected by climate change. And there's already been some changes in Korea. We've seen increases in the monsoon, in the strength of the monsoon, and also flooding in Seoul. That's kind of unusual. So Korea is trying to sort of understand this phenomenon by doing research in the Arctic and also in the Antarctic. And I think what's kind of interesting development with regard to its icebreakers this year, it's going to be participating in some search and rescue activities this summer. So we can see that the country is really branching out in terms of science and research, but also getting involved in these other domains that maybe used to just be the domain of the Arctic states themselves. So with all of that in mind, thinking about the country's interests in the Arctic and what's really driving it to be involved there, one question I also pose is whether this is sort of shaping a new Arctic region. Can we think of the Arctic as not just, say, where there's a lot of ice or north of the Arctic Circle? There's a lot, it's already very contentious how to describe the Arctic, but I think we can even consider possibly whether the Arctic and Asia or Northeast Asia could sort of be seen as one region. So this is sort of an excerpt of this map that I made, but traditionally we think of Korea situated on the Korean peninsula. So North Korea is to the north, we have Russia, China, Mongolia, and Japan, and it's sort of near abroad, if you will. But if we take a sort of more bird's eye view of Korea's position in the world, we actually can see that it ties in fairly nicely along this northern sea route to places in Northern Europe and maybe even Alaska along the Great North Pacific shipping route. So we can I think this just sort of helps to reframe the conceptualization of the Arctic and where it sits in the world. And I think what Aki mentioned about Hokkaido in Japan possibly being considered a port along the northern sea route, I think that further highlights that we need to really question what does destinational shipping in the Arctic mean. Is it just from Norway to Vladivostok, or can we think about it going to Japan and Korea, even to Iceland, Greenland? So kind of just taking a step back and looking at what does the Arctic mean. So I've sort of tried to identify what Korea's interests in the Arctic are and maybe looking at the region of the Arctic, but now I'd like to turn a little bit towards the role of Korea and seeing what it's really trying to do in the world and also in the Arctic specifically. So one thing that Korea's been promoting as of late is this policy of global Korea. So I think whereas in the 90s, early 2000s, Korea was more focused on issues around the Korean peninsula, specifically North Korea, now it has a much more global outlook. And global Korea is this policy that was coined by former President Lee Myung-bak. So just a few pictures to sort of highlight what it's done lately. Just last October, Korea won the bid to host the United Nations Green Climate Fund. So this sort of plays into the idea that Korea is really trying to come across to the rest of the planet as a responsible global citizen that's not just self-preoccupied, but also is looking to really play some important and significant role in combating climate change on a global level. And the next picture here is one of some Korean special forces in Somalia that are on board a ship that was seized by pirates, and this is actually a Korean ship. So we can see in this picture, first of all, Korea's ships are going all over the world in terms of carrying goods in and out of the country, and also the Navy now is being transformed into a blue water fleet that is able to project power not just around Korea itself, but even as far away as the Gulf of Aden, Somalia. So it's teaming up with other countries to do that. And the last picture here is President Lee Myung-bak, and I think this is a picture taken at the recent G20 summit in Seoul a couple years ago, and Korea actually was the first non-G8 country to host a G20 summit. So we really see that Korea is trying to get out there and demonstrate that it's not just a small player in terms of foreign policy, but also has a lot of other interests outside of Korean Peninsula. So with that in mind, sort of contextualizing the broader framework of Korea's foreign policy, what can it offer to the Arctic? I think some of the key things here are infrastructure, investments, and markets. So in terms of infrastructure, Korea has a lot of knowledge, especially in offshore and in offshore technology and Arctic technology for drilling, for instance. And this is interesting because even though Korea doesn't really have too many offshore resources to develop itself, it's been able to develop the technology that it can export to places like Norway. I think in Hammerfest, one of the drilling platforms there was built in Korea. So we see that this is one area where it's seen that it has a lot of engineering know-how, maybe developed from, say, working in steel and shipbuilding, that it's able to apply to other sectors. So this is something that Arctic countries, especially I would say Norway and Russia, in the next couple of years might be interested in importing from Korea. And second, it has investments to be able to offer. It has a growing economy, and I mentioned that the KOGAS sent a delegation to the Northwest Territories. So Korea's country and companies can really bring a lot of money to places in the Arctic, especially in search of natural resources, I think. And the third thing to point out is markets. Korea has a large market for, or large demand for goods from, say, Europe, and I think just to highlight that, it's one of the fastest growing trading partners of Norway, and I think last year trade increased 70% with Norway, so it could soon surpass China as Norway's biggest trading partner in Asia, which is surprising given the relatively small size of the population compared to China. There's really a lot of growth in that relationship between Norway and Korea, which I think is going to be really interesting as this continues into the future with Arctic relations in general. And one figure to show here to demonstrate Korea's commitment to investing in the Arctic is that the government said that they want to invest over $3 billion in the offshore and Arctic sectors by 2020. So I think one thing that the Arctic Council is really looking for in permanent observers is sort of a demonstration and commitment to the region. And I think just this alone shows that Korea is really committed to staying in the Arctic, at least economically, at the very least, through the next decade. So a lot of people wonder what the legitimacy is of the various Asian states that are trying to get involved in the Arctic. And, do they have a legitimate interest in being there? Is it more than just economics and, say, some sort of geopolitical power play? I think Korea is really trying hard to show that it is a legitimate actor, if you will, in the region. And when we think about the Arctic Council, I think it's sort of an unusual multilateral organization in that it doesn't just include traditional nation states as its members. It has the permanent participants, which are the 6 indigenous organizations that cross international boundaries in certain cases. And I think that actually adds to the Arctic Council's strength, the fact that it's non-traditional and includes a variety of different stakeholders. And I think if it were to include states that don't necessarily have territory in the Arctic, such as Korea, this could actually bolster its own legitimacy as an organization, because it would be including these countries that, like Korea, I think I've demonstrated, have very real interests in the Arctic and real concerns. And if it were to incorporate these new actors in its discussions, that would help strengthen the organization itself, instead of having countries like China, Japan, and Korea go outside the Arctic Council and discuss important issues there in other forums. I think that's something the Arctic Council should seek to avoid. So this here's a picture of former President Lee Myung-bak with Dmitry Medvedev a couple of years ago, and this is sort of one relationship that's really grown lately between Korea and Russia. Korea's interests in Russia actually go back more than just a couple of years. It goes back, I think, at least to the early 90s, where Korea was really starting to invest in, say, looking at the Trans-Siberian Railroad as a possible route to bring in goods from Europe across Russia. And now we're looking more at say, maritime shipping routes instead of overland routes. But this is something that Korea and Russia are working on. And also there's talk of them building a natural gas pipeline from Russia, actually through North Korea to South Korea. So this could be a big shift in terms of just Korea's ability to access new energy resources. And the whole time that Korea is really discussing these sort of economic interests with countries like Russia bilaterally, I think in the back of its mind it's thinking, well, how can we get into the Arctic Council? How can we make this sort of more of a multilateral acceptance of our interests and legitimacy rather than just a bilateral acceptance? And another relationship to sort of focus on is Korea and Norway, as I mentioned before. In September, actually, President Lee Myung-bak traveled to Greenland and Norway on, I think, what was a very historic trip for him and for Korea as a country. And when he was in Oslo here, he and Prime Minister Stoltenberg signed two memoranda of agreement, or two memoranda of understanding, one on green shipbuilding. So I think this is an area where Korea is seeing some sort of economic opportunity to really build ships that are green and more ecologically friendly than before. And the second MOU was on just developing the Northern Sea Route. So I think that's something that both Norway and Korea, as sort of at larger ends of the Northern Sea Route, if we think of it as not just confined to Russia, are interested in doing in order to develop trade possibilities and grow their economies. So I think the main question for Arctic states to consider is really, if they're going to accept new permanent observers, what does it mean to be an Arctic state? Is it just something that has to do with territory and merely having land north of, say, 60 degrees or north of the Arctic Circle, or is it something that has to do with identity more broadly construed? Identity in terms of a country merely just being involved in science or economic activities in the region. That's something that's going to be really controversial, as we all know, but it'll be interesting to see how it develops, especially later this year when the Arctic Council reconvenes. So, thank you.